This is Dr. Kling, and for those of you who understand the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model of a macroeconomics textbook, this talk is going to take you to the next level. It's going to go from understanding to confusion. So your understanding has the price level on the vertical axis, GDP on the horizontal axis, and you have an aggregate supply curve and an aggregate demand curve. And that's very nice because any combination of changes you can explain. If prices and output go up from the starting point, that suggests that the aggregate demand curve shifted to the right. If they go down, it suggests it shifted to the left. And then if you want to try to explain a combination of higher prices and lower GDP, then you can tell a story of an aggregate supply curve shifting to the left. So it's all fun, and you might think you're very clear about it. But here are a couple things. First, the economists don't really think in terms of the price level and GDP as a relationship. They mostly focus on inflation, which is the rate of change of the price level. So they focus on inflation. And yet you don't see an inflation as the variable used on this axis. And a lot of the point of my talk is to explain why you don't see that. Where you do see inflation is in the Phillips curve. So you have inflation and you have unemployment. Okay, and so because you're having unemployment, which is sort of a bad thing, as opposed to GDP, which is a good thing, what amounts to the aggregate supply curve, I'll call it the aggregate supply curve question mark, which is the Phillips curve, is downward sloping. It's not upward sloping. You could fix that by putting GDP on the axis. You could have, if we put GDP on this axis and kind of plotted a Phillips curve like this, if this is inflation, we could have an upward sloping aggregate supply curve with inflation and GDP. We could, but for some reason economists don't do that, and let me try to explain why they don't do that. Let me give you a simple aggregate demand model. I'm going to write MV, money, the velocity of money, and I'm going to put a parentheses with some dots in the middle, equals PY. So this is typically the monetarist model of aggregate demand. What monetarists hold velocity constant. You can make this a Keynesian model, and I have, by putting these three dots in here, saying that velocity can change as a result of things. So it could, for example, if there's a stimulative fiscal policy, then that will increase velocity. And so we can do Keynesian economics with this aggregate demand curve. To turn it into an aggregate demand curve, let's do MV, I'm going to divide both sides by P, equals Y. And remember, Y is the same as GDP. So now we have an aggregate demand curve. But here's the weird thing. If we put the price level as our main focus, then aggregate demand is downward sloping. That is, as the price level goes up, aggregate demand goes down. But remember, there's stuff inside here, and inside here is inflation. As inflation goes up, velocity goes up, and therefore aggregate demand goes up. Therefore aggregate demand goes up. So what does that mean? So we have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve with respect to the price, but we have an upward sloping aggregate demand curve with respect to inflation. And so this is why you don't see the aggregate supply, aggregate demand analysis done with inflation here. because what you would have is aggregate supply like that, and then aggregate demand as another upward sloping curve. So because as inflation goes up, aggregate demand goes up. So that's confusing to people because it doesn't look like a typical demand curve. And in fact, if you're not careful and you don't draw the aggregate demand curve as shallower than the aggregate supply curve, you get perverse results. But doing it this way, if we raise aggregate demand, which means raising inflation, not shifting the curve to the right, but shifting it kind of up to the left, then you do get more output. So this is a kind of a peculiar story in which you have two upward sloping curves for aggregate supply and aggregate demand. But it's worse than that because the inflation for the aggregate supply and aggregate demand is two different things. For the aggregate supply, we're talking about unexpected inflation. Again, we're just talking about the very short run here. I'm not saying anything about long run. So when unexpected inflation goes up, aggregate supply goes up. And with aggregate demand, it's expected inflation that raises aggregate demand. That is, if people are expecting inflation, that's when they want to kind of get rid of their money balances and buy goods, and that raises aggregate demand. So we have two separate kind of graphs in a sense. I mean, one way to describe it is in terms of unexpected inflation. I'll just abbreviate that. Then we have sort of aggregate demand doesn't depend on that, and aggregate supply upward sloping. And then expected inflation, we get the opposite. We get aggregate demand up, but aggregate supply doesn't depend on it. So there really is no coherent way to represent aggregate demand and aggregate supply in the inflation space because of this distinction. So I'm just going to leave it there and just say that the picture of aggregate supply and aggregate demand is internally very confusing the more you look at it.